Hi, it's Tom Taylor. Please feel free now with 5 minutes before the beginning of the session to, as traditional, let us know where you are in the world and, if you like, what's the weather like where you are.
Thanks a lot, Dawn.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, you sound good.
All right, well, we shall kick off. And maybe just using your own term there, Dawn. Putting it out and gleaning from the wisdom of God. Have a little bit of interference there. So just throwing it out to all our colleagues today. First question. What do you think of when you hear the word storytelling? What were your first thoughts? When you saw this webinar coming through? So it'll be interesting to get your feedback. There.
It's a very good question, isn't it? What do you think of when you hear the word storytelling? Cool, says TRS. Engagement, that's some interesting feedback we're getting. Learning from life. So, somebody says not something I do well. I think we're all natural storytellers, surely.
Jackanory.
Like that.
Fun. That's an interesting one. Listening. Cave people. So Cheryl, perhaps alluding to the fact that we're all natural storytellers, or we have it as a natural part of our culture. The Crick Crack Club in London, says Kate. I have no idea what you're talking about. You may wish to share that with us later on. Maureen, Pat, are these the sort of comments you're expecting to get from people?
Absolutely, some good ones coming there. Very much. When we often ask this question when we're running our storytelling workshops, and we get a whole range, say from the Jackanory, you know, reading stories in children, and library. And like, good to see Fiona there mentioning fun. Yes, storytelling is all about fun. And certainly we are, when we're talking about storytelling and learning, we're bringing in a lot of that. But in particular, when we're thinking of the learning and development mix, what we're really interested in, and again, just bringing out some of the comments that were made earlier about experiences, what we're really trying to do with storytelling is to capture the lived experience, the individual, the personal stories, so that they can be used in multiple ways. And again, within the learning and development mix, or even potentially throughout an organisation. So we're really looking at how can we use stories to retain knowledge, maybe to address the brain drain that's happening globally, retaining that knowledge and experience to capture that tacit knowledge that a lot of us have in our head and find difficult to articulate, something beyond the water cooler conversations. And it's interesting, someone made mention there that we're all, or even yourself there, John, mentioned that we're all natural storytellers. But it's interesting, sometimes we can free flow conversations, stories with colleagues, but there is this notion, and it's a great term, this notion of de-storification of our culture. How we can actually capture a story ourselves and share that story in a little bit more structure so that it can be used for learning. Can be quite a tough challenge. But certainly what we're trying to look at when we're embodying stories in learning is how can we capture those learning experience in order that we can personalize learning and encourage reflection, all those good things that we hear about in encouraging discussion. Because certainly when we talk about storytelling, we're trying to move beyond the notion of the sanitized messages that we often hear throughout an organisation, in particular when we have scripted e-learning. We're being delivered out a certain message with typically quite a corporate corporate wrapper around it. So certainly when we're looking at storytelling, we're trying to move beyond that, try to move beyond the governing narrative. And again, very, very important when we're thinking about learning and development today and the whole drive towards performance. We are looking and exploring different ways, and indeed how storytelling can support those three great P's of performance, productivity and profitability. So what we're going to look at today is one particular case study. Within the HSE, the Health Service Executive, and Pat's going to speak about that. But even before we get into that, I thought just to put a little bit of context, we're obviously focusing on storytelling today, but storytelling in the context of a broader learning and development mix, in that we're looking at, and hopefully we're all seeing there, our little hello?
You're still with us, Maureen. I don't know. Did you hear that? Was that coming from your end?
No, I don't believe so, Don. And the other thing too is that the slide hasn't advanced. Maureen has moved to her next slide, but it's not showing on your screen.
Well, I've got the word cloud on the on two of my machines here. I don't have it on the on my iPad, but I've just checked my iPad. I've got it on my iPad as well, so it is advancing as far as I can see.
Okay, that's cool.
Excellent. So indeed, stories do form part of the broader mix, and we're not saying that we're using storytelling, obviously, and we're throwing that baby out with the bathwater. Where we see stories fitting in is very much within the overall learning and development mix. We're looking at performance, champions around the organisation, and certification. But again, the focus of today is just how we're using storytelling in one particular instance as part of that, as I say, that wider mix. So say we're going to get into, Pat's going to talk to us about one particular project that we're using within the Health Service Executive, within our online learning centre within the Health Service Executive. Which is called HSE Land, and again, I'm happy to send out the links to HSC Land later. But before we get into the digital stories project, maybe just to give you a little bit of background on HSC Land. So HSC is an online learning centre, and as you said, Dawn, within HSC there's approximately 100,000 members of staff, and we're pleased to say within HSC Land we've got 68,000 of those 100,000 as active learners. Now HSC, the HSC Online Learning Centre, HSC Land, it embodies lots of different types of learning. As you might imagine, we've got the formal online structured e-learning programs, combining with an increasing number of social learning tools within our practice development hub. Just flicking through a couple of screens here. And also the much more structured CPD tools around ePortfolio. So we are combining lots of different types of learning within HSC Land. But what we're going to focus on for the next 10-15 minutes is one particular project that we've been working very closely with Pat and colleagues within the HSE. Around digital stories. So at this point, I'm just going to hand over to Pat, who's just going to take us through the project.
Very good afternoon to everybody. In recent years here in Ireland, and indeed this is the case, I think, throughout considerable parts of the world, healthcare has been evolved into an even more technical and very highly scientific process. There's an ever-increasing demand for improvements in patient outcomes, for excellence in care, and that's largely been driven by advances in medical science, but it's also critically being driven by demands from people for better health services. People now are much better informed about illnesses and the potential treatments that are available for them. But despite all of those advances, the other thing that is happening is that there is an increase in the number of complaints from patients about the care they receive. Now, what's really interesting about many of these issues is that they have less to do with clinical outcomes and more to do with the experience of being cared for. For example, in Ireland, in the HSE, last year, there was an increase of 44% in patient complaints. In the UK, the NHS is recording approximately 3,000 patient complaints every week. Now, what these complaints largely reflect are people's experience of being cared for. In other words, how they are being treated. The attitude of nurses, the attitude of doctors, the degree of involvement that that people are experiencing in their care. A book that I have read recently called The Wounded Storyteller, authored by a medical practitioner called Arthur W. Frank. And his story is that he was threatened with a very serious illness, and despite having been in medical practice for a very considerable period of time, he was quite taken aback at how he was being treated as a patient. And he's making the point that really our health services are largely driven by, they're resource driven, they're being driven by the amount of financial and personnel resources that we have, and that is important. But he's saying that we need to move over to what he calls a morally driven health service. And we'll come on to that now in a wee second. Essentially, what all of these, despite all of these advances, really what seems to be happening is that there's something missing from our health services. Okay, the preeminent method of human communication is through stories. For generation upon generation, people have talked about events, important events, trivial events. They talk about what they think about something, and they tend to do that through stories. And in the context of nursing and medical science, and there's a growing body of opinion that says that it's really, really important that we find ways of engaging with people's stories. Now, not in a sort of an academic or esoteric way. And what these people are promoting is a way of engaging with people so that we understand their lived experience. Robin Youngson, who is a consultant anaesthetist in New Zealand, has recently written that the outcomes for patients can be influenced positively to a very, very significant degree indeed by engaging with them, by forming a human bond with them. Now, it's a limited bond, I'll grant you, because it's in the context of being a patient and needing care. But he's saying that it's really, really, really important to engage at that human level. I have included this quote from Della Pollock, who is a professor in the United States. I'm not going to read it for you, but perhaps you might take an opportunity just to take a look at it there whilst I'm speaking. And in this quote, what Pollock is suggesting is that it is through stories that we understand an experience. It can be a personal experience, or it can be even a global experience. But we make sense of events by telling stories. And indeed, the key strength that Pollock is highlighting for stories is their capacity change things. And what we're trying to do in the HSE is to harness people's stories in order to change the way we deliver care for the better. There is a critical question here which is posed on the screen in front of you. I will read this out if you don't mind. And it says, do I want the other person to understand what I mean, or do I want the other person to simply do as I say? Now, I think that it's worth considering that from a teaching point of view, from an instructional point of view. Because the thinking behind using narrative learning, using stories to teach, is that when people understand the story of something, when they understand the context of something, it's much more likely that they're going to engage with it, and that they're going to actually use that experience then to improve their practice. And I noted actually a comment from someone earlier, Debola, I think it was. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Debola. And you were talking about the capacity of stories to engage people and to help them connect with each other. And in a health context, that's absolutely critically important. So just to go over that again, essentially what we're saying here is that people assert meaning to their lives through narratives, through stories, and stories are told everywhere. And I know some people earlier was suggesting that perhaps they weren't terribly good at telling stories. I'll bet you probably are, actually, because we tell stories all of the time. We just don't think that we are sometimes. To place this in a it's sort of a theoretical context for you. Narrative learning is a form of constructivist learning, and what's been suggested there is that learning occurs by attaching meaning to something. Now, whether it's an event or it's information that you're getting, it's likely only to stick if you understand the context and you're able to work out what it means to you in your particular context. It's a basic tenet of adult learning theory that people bring their lived experience. So, you know, if you're going to engage in a learning enterprise with adults, it's really, really important that there's a space given for the experience that people bring, for their knowledge and their life experience. And indeed, if one doesn't, then the reality is that training or learning is likely to be less effective. It's regrettable, actually, that a lot of work-based learning seems to ignore the lived experience. It's hard to find the space for it, and I think that would tend to have a negative impact on the effectiveness of the teaching. Three types of narrative learning have been described by Clark and Rossiter. Learning journals, autobiographical writing, and instructional case studies. Now, to a large extent, we're concentrating on the third of those, but I just wanted to put this in a context because we've spent a lot of time, a great deal of time over the last couple of years, thinking about stories, thinking about people's personal histories and how they should be used in order to inform how we practice. So stories provide for us an opportunity of engaging with an event or with a learning experience, and they provide the ability for us to connect, as Deborah was saying earlier, and to share the learning experience. And I'd like to invite all of you now to do just that. We're about to play a very, very short digital story that I put together, and I put it together from a book by a lady called Audre Lorde, who was a very well-known American writer and who developed breast cancer. And she described a very nice story that I think will provide us with an opportunity to think about how stories might be used. I would say that we did this. We've obviously been developing digital stories, and indeed we have a collection of approximately 20 stories now from patients, from carers, and indeed from clinicians. But you'll understand that it's difficult for us to share those because they were provided to us for use within HSE, and we wouldn't have permission to make those more broadly available. But I think that this story from Audre Lorde will help to illustrate some of the points. So you might just sit back now and just watch this video.
Ten days after having my breast removed, I went to my doctor's office to have the stitches taken out. This was my first journey out since coming home from the hospital, and I was truly looking forward to it. A friend had washed my hair for me, and it was black and shining, with my new grey hairs glistening in the sun. Colour was starting to come back into my face and around my eyes. I wore the most opalescent of my moonstones, and a single floating bird dangling from my right ear in the name of grand symmetry. With an African kente cloth tunic and new leather boots. I knew I looked fine, with that brave, newborn security of a beautiful woman having come through a very hard time and being very glad to be alive. I felt really good, within the limits of that grey mush that still persisted in my brain from the effects of the anaesthesia. When I walked into the doctor's office, I was really rather pleased with myself, all things considered. Pleased with the way I felt, with my own flair, with my own style. The doctor's nurse, a charmingly bright and steady woman of about my own age, who had always given me the feeling of a quite no-nonsense support on my other visits, called me into the examining room. On my way, she asked me how I was feeling. Pretty good, I said, half expecting her to make some comment about how good I looked. You're not wearing a prosthesis, she said, a little anxiously, and not at all like a question. No, I said, thrown off my guard for a minute. It really doesn't feel right, referring to the landful puff given to me by the Reach for Recovery volunteer in the hospital. Usually supportive and understanding, the nurse now looked at me urgently and disapprovingly, as she told me that even if it didn't exactly look right, it was better than nothing, and that as soon as my stitches were out, I should be fitted for a real form. You will feel so much better with it on, she said, and besides, we really like you to wear something, at least when you come in. Otherwise, it's bad for the morale of the office.
Maureen, I'm sorry, we had some comments that the video stream was not coming over quite as clearly as might have been, as people would have wished. Could you possibly just paraphrase what Audrey was saying during that story?
Absolutely. So Audrey is speaking about her first visit back to her consultant, what we might regard as an outpatient appointment. She was feeling very, very positive indeed. Her hair had begun to grow back, and she was pleased with how she looked. And she was, this is a difficult period for anybody shortly after mastectomy, and she was well pleased to be in such a positive frame of mind. She went to the hospital and she was greeted by a nurse she was very familiar with, and the nurse observed that Audrey wasn't actually wearing her prosthesis. And it became clear that the nurse was somewhat displeased about this, and the nurse attempted to encourage her to use the prosthesis. Now, Audrey had made a very conscious decision not to wear the prosthesis. And finishes her explanation by saying that really they prefer for patients to wear the prosthesis because if they don't, it's bad for morale within the clinic. That's essentially the nub of the story. I hope everybody's been able to hear that okay.
I hope so. We do have an issue, which is there's background chat of a quiet.
Yes, we're picking it up here as well.
It's not from your end, and I do apologise to everybody. I'm not quite sure where it's coming from. We're not broadcasting from a pub, Keith Flanagan. If we were, I can assure you it would be far more raucous. So can I just ask if there's anybody who's listening in via the phone, and I don't think actually there is, looking at the roster, then please could you mute your phone? Otherwise, I have to suspect that we have some form of crossed line through the audio bridge that we've got, in which case there's nothing we can do about it. I'll just ask Pat and Maureen if you could talk more loudly, and that will at least drown out the background noise, if nothing else. So if you are dialing in, please can you mute your phone just in case it's that. I'm assuming it's some sort of crossed line. Pat and Murphy, Maureen, if you could talk loudly, that would be great. Back to you guys now.
All right, we'll certainly do our best to do that. What we wanted to invite each of you to do was to just take a moment to think about that story. And the question that I wanted to pose to people was, how might you make use of that story to aid learning? Can you think of ways that you might perhaps make use of that story that would help you to do some training around some aspect of care? And I appreciate not all of you come from, in fact, probably most of you don't come from a health background, but the story really does have a generic flavour to it, doesn't it? Because, you know, how we approach customers, for example, how we approach clients, how we relate to them, is of key importance. And whilst the nurse was anxious to talk about how morale in the office might be affected, really what she should have been focused on was where her patient was. So we just want you to take a minute, perhaps, to think about how you might use that story. And please do put your suggestions into the chat. And I think Don is going to keep an eye on that to, so that we can flag up some responses. Whilst that's happening, I've noticed again a couple of comments from Devil. I hope you don't mind me focusing on you, but you're absolutely right when you assert that stories will help people to actually add to the story and change the ending, which is what Della Pollock is suggesting. In other words, you take a story like Audrey's story and you use it and you change the ending by making sure that patients are not being responded to in the way that she was.
It's a very interesting set of answers we've got coming through, and people are all focusing on the idea that the institution is trying to impose a form of behaviour that suits the institution rather than the individual to whom it is supposed to be servicing or serving. And it's very interesting. People are saying, I would encourage trainees to put themselves in the character's position. Catherine saying there's no sense the individual mattered. Cheryl, that brings out the key point here is by using the story, you can put people in the position of the person who suffered as a result of it. It could have been me, is the story. She is the phrase she uses. Other people are using the phrase, look, you can put them in other people's shoes using stories. I think that's a really good way of describing the power of stories to get people to change behaviour through an emotional impact. So that's the reaction I'm getting from the feedback we've got here, Pat.
Well, that's exactly right. And you refer to somebody making the point there about how the institution was fashioning the response in the context of the institution's needs. And this is a theme that is very, very heavily present in a lot of the current thinking and writing around how we actually deliver care. Now, I don't mean medicine. I mean the actual caring part, that essentially it is institutionally driven, and we need to change that. And indeed, to be fair to my own organisation, the HSE, and indeed to the NHS, for example, those initiatives, the concentration on working with people from their context, on responding to their needs, is something that's been driven from the very top of both of those organisations. But there's still quite a long way to go. There's some absolutely fabulous, and thank you all very, very much indeed for engaging with the story and for your comments. certainly looking forward to reviewing those later. They're coming through thick and fast, and I'm most grateful to you for engaging with the story. I'll move on now, if I may, and just very briefly show you or talk to you about one way that we have used another type of story, a drama. And essentially, we use this approach in a program that we developed last year on the early identification of memory problems. Now, the reason that this was very, very important was because often older people will present in emergency departments and they'll be somewhat confused, and it's often assumed that that's because they have dementia. They're older, so they have dementia. In reality, quite a large proportion of those people don't have dementia at all. They have a thing called delirium, which arises from an infection and can actually be life-threatening. So understanding how to identify and respond to memory problems is really, really important. And I think we're just going to show you a very short little clip here, and then I'll explain the context of it in just a couple of minutes. So this is just very short, actually shorter than the last video. Bear with us if it doesn't work as well. I'll explain what's happening immediately afterwards anyway. Don, I hope that you're seeing a new screen. We'll just scroll very quickly down to the video.
Yeah, we've got you working your way through the menu.
That's fantastic. Okay, so just to explain this particular slide, what's happening here, you see two boxes, and in the leftmost box is a video. And Maureen might just press the begin button there, and we're just going to let it play for just a couple of seconds. Could even move it on just a second or two, Maureen, to get past the tea making.
Oh, upstairs, you know.
Okay.
You know, I think it's all, I'm just tired really, you know. Yeah. Are you worried?
Now,
Think about your memory.
what actually is happening in this video, I'm not going to try to play it because we're clearly having some difficulties and time is running short. But what happens here is that the older of the two women here is a lady who is living at home. She's looking after a very sick husband, and she has begun to get a little worried about herself. She notices that her memory is beginning to slip. She's starting to forget things, and she's worried about herself. This is the nurse who has come to visit the husband, actually, but she very sensibly and wisely detects that something is wrong, and so she sits down and she talks to Carmel about what's bothering her. And during that narrative, Carmel begins to describe a story where she's encountering increasing difficulties with her memory. Now, this might be because she's beginning to get dementia, or it might simply be because she's run down and stressed. So we'll just move on to the next slide now. So we have our story, and people will have had an opportunity to look at it. And on this next slide then, what we essentially provide our learners with is an opportunity then to engage with the story and to consider how they might respond to Carmel going forward. And this simply works by presenting learners with a range of optional responses. There are none of them completely wrong. There are really good responses, and then there are perhaps not so good responses. And the idea is to work your way through that story and try to figure out how best to help Carmel at this particular moment in her life. So that's just another example of how we have been using stories on HSE land. We'll just move on there, Maureen, because time is wrapping up. What I hope you're looking at there now is a screenshot of our new Digital Stories Hub, and that is where we are intending to host all of our stories from patients, from carers, and from clinicians. And again, we'll be looking to encourage even healthcare professionals to engage with those stories in much the same way as you guys have here today, and to use those stories to improve how they deliver care within the ward. And very quickly then, we'll just move to my last slide, and then I'll hand over to Maureen. The process that we have been following here is that people are invited to work with us to share their stories. We spend quite a bit of time talking with them and making sure that we're able to answer any of their questions. When we come to record the stories, they take very much the format of a conversation between myself and the storyteller, and that's videotaped. Those conversations typically take around about an hour. And we always make sure that we have plenty of time either side of that hour. So there's loads of time in advance of recording and there's loads of time afterwards to make sure that we're sending people away in a good state, in a positive frame of mind. And if issues are thrown up for them from the stories, we want to make absolutely sure that we have the capacity to work with them and to help them through that at that time. We then go away and that video is edited down from sometimes an hour down to certainly less than 10 minutes. And we build a story from that raw material. Now at that point, each of our storytellers is asked to look at the final product, and only at that point are they asked to sign off, because that's actually the end story. So it's a very iterative and cooperative process, and at all times we're very, very anxious to make sure that we are complying with the wishes of our storytellers, whether they're patients, carers or clinicians. Okay. So again, here's just a slide just outlining some of the key requirements. Our environment needs to be very safe. It needs to be a reflective, relaxed environment. The relationship between the storyteller and the, for lack of a better word, the interviewer is of critical importance. It needs to be a very safe and secure conversation because we're looking to really tap into something that's quite deep for people. And I must say I have been absolutely blown away and very deeply honoured at the degree to which people are willing to share their stories because they know they're being used or going to be used to help nurses, doctors and other therapists look at and think about how they deliver care. Okay, so I'll hand over now to, thank you all for listening to me, and I'll just hand over now to Maureen for the next few minutes.
Okay, thanks, Pat. And as Pat was saying, you know, within HSC land, we've got our suite of digital stories that are being placed in the first instance, a self-directed learning asset, and then encouraging our practitioners and our users within HSC land to comment on that, and a little bit of social learning around the stories, what indeed they're learning from it. So that's certainly one context in which digital stories are being used. There's obviously other ways that stories can be used in learning. I'm just